All right.
They don't look asleep.
This is the last session.
Yeah, sorry.
This is the last session before the cocktail hour.
Wow.
So these are the truly dedicated. But welcome, Mr. Chairman. This is a great honor to have you here. We were recalling that it's been several years since a member of Congress has come to the Bretton Woods Committee, and we think it's a really appropriate time, and definitely given your perch chairing the Financial Services Committee, for you to come and speak with us. Just to maybe acquaint the audience with your background, French is a deeply experienced person, not just in government, but also in the private sector. So he worked for the precursor to the NEC.
I did.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Under George H.W. Bush, was at the Treasury Department, founded and ran a bank, and now is a member of Congress and chairman of the committee that oversees, or has jurisdiction over the IFIs. And so it's a great honor to be here with you today. Maybe just to start off, we're here at the Bretton Woods Committee. Trade is a critical part of the global economy, informs a lot of how certainly people here are thinking and approaching the week. And you follow financial markets closely, so there are people here from the financial sector. So do you think markets and participants have a good understanding of what the president's trying to achieve and where that landing zone is? Talk to us a little bit about how you're currently reading the policy situation here.
Well, I don't think the markets have clarity about the president's ultimate landing zone, as you describe it, on tariffs. And I think that's created the uncertainty in both the fixed income and the equity markets, or at least contributed to it. People could argue stock prices were very, very high over the course of 2024 and early 2025, and therefore some correction might have been merited. But my view is that the president's trying to do several tariff strategies all at once, and some of those are in conflict with each other. And for example, to use tariffs as a sanction, meaning if you don't accept this repatriation of citizens, or if you don't help us interdict fentanyl, that might be considered a very short-term strategic use of a sanction, a tariff like a sanction. But then you have this issue of across-the-board tariffs across all imports. You have strategic categories where the president's goal is to have more long-term investment and employment here, like in steel and aluminum connected to national security interest or semiconductors. You have the issue of reciprocity, of lowering reciprocity, removing non-tariff barriers, lowering tariff barriers. And my judgment is some of these things are in conflict with each other. Some are best handled by a bilateral negotiation or a specific targeted tariff rather than being across the board. And so I think that accounts for some of the unease in the markets and among the business community is tell us what the outcome is that you'd like, and let's work towards that point. And I think that still appears to be under development.
You wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago going through the history of tariff authority, really, and Congress's role in that. And one thing that you argued for was to actually grant the president trade promotion authority. We have negotiations underway, right? We have delegations coming through Washington. There are some that are here this week. Talk to me a little bit about, or tell us a little bit about how you see TPA, right, as it's known here in Washington, being supportive or helping to provide that clarity or helping the U.S. achieve its objectives.
Well, I think trade promotion authority is the Congress granting their Article I authority to the executive for negotiating trade treaties for commercial purposes and setting tariffs. And this dates back really to 1934, after the Congress just wore itself out setting tariff rates between, say, 1830 and 1930. They just literally couldn't do it anymore. They were literally meeting and going down lists of 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 items and setting a tariff rate in the Ways and Means Committee. And so they said, we got to get out of this business. We have an income tax now in our country. So they granted trade promotion authority to the president back in 1934. And we've updated that many, many times since then. Most recently in 2015, the Congress authorized during the Obama administration Trade Promotion Authority, granting the parameters around which the president could negotiate a multilateral trade arrangement or a bilateral arrangement and submit that to the Senate for ratification. That's the point of it. And that expired. Joe Biden let that Trade Promotion Authority expire in the summer of 2021. I think that was a mistake, and I think the Congress should have reauthorized it then. But the Congress did not. And so I would think that would be in President Trump's interest to have TPA authority under the Republican Congress in the House and Senate, authorize TPA authority, because the last president to use it successfully was who? Donald Trump. That's how USMCA was brought to the Congress, negotiated between the three countries, and then ratified. So I think that's one way Congress can best handle their oversight of the executive on trade.
Let's move a little bit to the World Bank. We had President Bonga here earlier, and you know, I think maybe something this audience may not fully appreciate is just how much you've been kind of a thought leader on this in Congress over the years. You gave an interview recently to DevEx, and you talked about kind of this concept of having MDBs return to their core mission. What does that look like in your view? For those that didn't quite catch that, I mean, elucidate a little bit about where you see the core focus of these institutions, where it should be placed.
Well, I think the core focus of our multilateral development banks, obviously starting with the World Bank itself, is helping nations, particularly low-income nations, develop an economy that works for more of their citizens. I mean, the bottom line is the mission should be to eradicate poverty. It should be to have work and education and clean water and public health policies that work for the citizens in those countries. That should be at the heart of it. I noted in this year's annual report, the World Bank, they said that 45% of their lending was related to climate. And no doubt some climate-related investments benefit low-income citizens and perhaps work to eliminate poverty. But, you know, half the lending of the bank is dedicated towards climate instead of focusing on poverty. In that same annual report, if my memory's right, climate was mentioned, you know, over 100 times, and HIV/AIDS or malaria or some other public health crisis, clean drinking water wasn't mentioned. So I think we're off course. I think that should be the function of our multilateral development banks.
Think about, I mean, so maybe I'll press on that a little bit. There was this concept, right, that's been kind of layered on, right, the MDBs more recently about they need to serve a purpose to kind of address, you know, and finance global public goods, right? And so that, you know, commonly, right, as you described that was climate, there are some aspects of that trickles into public health, right, pandemic preparedness. I mean, how do you see kind of the institutions playing in those spaces, or do you think the primary focus should be on this poverty alleviation and then see what co-benefits flow from that for these other benefits?
Well, there's no doubt that there are some public goods where the Venn diagram of poverty eradication, uplifting public health, and citizens' educational standards and their participation in the economy, and some larger goal like climate can overlap. I mean, a classic Venn diagram, I'm sure, that would have been embraced by our former vice president. But fundamentally, I still believe that it should be focused on that public health issue. Think about power. Power is a public good. Electricity generation, you know, in my judgment, could be considered its infrastructure. But without electricity, how do you have clean water? How do you have access to education and lighting and power to have businesses? And I'm a believer, as I've made clear, in all of the above energy policies, because if you put people first, having access to low-cost power, you know, is important to those public goods of education, health, and welfare.
So it appears, right, I mean, and the president was here earlier talking about what his agenda looks like and some of the changes that are underway there. It appears he may have taken a page out of your playbook, right? At least the roadmap you've been trying to lay out in Congress through hearings, through op-eds in the media on a different energy strategy for the World Bank. And a key component of that, and it was talked about here earlier, was nuclear.
Right.
Can you talk about kind of the, how is that being received in Congress, right? I mean, how are you watching that from Capitol Hill?
Well, our members authored a bill to encourage our managing directors from the Treasury to the multilateral banks to encourage that nuclear financing not be taken off the table. It strikes me that you're just, if climate is your number one issue and you think a carbon-free future is essential to life on Earth, then how can you ignore the advances in technology that have led to the small modular nuclear reactor business, the fact that, like France for 60 years has used reprocessed fuel to generate nuclear power. We don't do that in the United States, so we have parking lots full of spent nuclear rods. So you have a smaller footprint, you have a cleaner technology, you have a lower cost technology, you have a technology that could last 100 years once it was constructed. Why would you take off the table nuclear power to generate the ultimate clean source? So that's point one. I recognize that not every country is capable of managing or handling that. That's a given. I got that. We're not imposing it on anyone. We're saying that right now you don't even finance it. And we've worked to have our Ex-Im Bank agree to finance exports that are related to nuclear technology. So this isn't to step it outside the bound of what's appropriate, but I think the Koreans, the Japanese, the Dutch, the French, the Americans all have the ability to produce nuclear power, and I want to see more competition. That I don't want to be the default nuclear energy developer as China or Russia. I don't think that's in the interest of the world.
Are there other bills or legislation the committee's contemplating that you hope will have the same kind of signaling value to shape policy?
Well, we did. That was a bipartisan bill, by the way, that we marked up a few weeks ago, and it'll go to the House floor. And I think it sends that signal. I'm so pleased that our president of the World Bank referenced that. I just believe in an all of the above energy strategy if your goal is global development, poverty eradication, lifting people up. Think about not investing in the fossil fuel business in Nigeria, and you let it languish, and you don't let it be at the highest and best use. You don't have it effectively managed. You don't remove the theft. You don't remove the loss. You have 200 million people that'll be on the doorstep of moving to Europe, I guess. So we need to plan for the future, and I think nuclear should be a part of that from a clean power point of view. But we've got to recognize that our development bank should be fully participating in making sure the energy needs of the globe's people are available. And there's even more pressure on that due to the electrification demands through global technology advance like artificial intelligence and large language model processing.
So we have the managing director of the IMF here in the audience, and she was here earlier addressing this crowd. And one thing that she spoke about that's in her global policy agenda, right, is kind of ending the repeat, kind of unending kind of borrowing, right, of some countries, and my views on this are known certainly by Kristalina and others, but that this is not a healthy way to run, right? Also not healthy for the country, right? One thing that we didn't hear, right, from the World Bank, right, is that there's a focus on graduation.
Yeah.
And so talk to me a little bit about kind of where you see that going, right, and what you would like to see there and what you think is achievable.
Well, I think that's an important point. It's an important point generally. And when you have public finance, when you have taxpayer money at risk or a public entity that's run by essentially global politicians at the top, it's tough because you have to reach consensus. But we see that in our own country. I just want to use one, real world example in America, and that is our flood insurance program that we've had in our country since 1968. It's the only place where the federal government, well, I'll leave out terror insurance, but the only fundamental place inside the economy where the federal government's on the hook for the first dollar of loss in a residential or commercial building inside a flood zone. But since 1968, we've been very reluctant to reform the program. And therefore, our taxpayers have rebuilt the same house in the same lot over and over and over again. And after Katrina, $750 million was lost due to not being used for resiliency. It was just people bought a boat or did something else with it. They didn't lift their house. And the percentage of rebuilding was offensive. And so this is not a new thing when you have politicians and money. But I think it's a worthy goal for the IMF to have, whether it's a 19th century serial violator of this concept, Argentina, for example, or a more modern country in the nation. And so I believe in graduation, and I think that helps you build relationships with the elected officials in parliamentary bodies that vote to support our multilateral institutions. You've heard it from President Trump directly, but you've heard it over and over again in the Congress under Republican and Democratic leadership for, I'll say, up to 20 years, that China should be graduated from their line of credit at the World Bank or the access to funding they have at the Asian Development Bank. And you will win over your oversight responsibility, your leadership responsibility if we do that. And so enough is enough at some point. And the whole mission of the IMF is to put people on a sustainable footing. And that's been our mission at the IMF for decades now. And it's tough. But I think it's an important step. And I think we ought to all, as directors and board members of both these institutions, have that as a goal in our planning, is that we will graduate either serial offenders in the case of the IMF or just countries that no longer should be qualified as a developing country in the case of the World Bank.
So kind of turning a bit to the IMF, talk to me a little bit about how you see the IMF fitting in with kind of U.S. strategic or foreign policy objectives, and how your colleagues in Congress kind of look at this institution.
Well, look, I believe strongly in our multilateral institutions. I just think they're unwieldy in terms of management, and it's a challenging job to have the leadership of any of them, and it requires a lot of diplomatic skills and stick-to-itiveness, but it also requires particularly the market economies, the large developed market economies, to stick together and help enforce reform. And the United States should be a leader in that effort, but we're not alone at all in that effort. And so in the case of the IMF, that's particularly important, I think, to the United States, is a multilateral forum whereby we can insist on debt transparency and push back against countries that would have a predatory, self-centered indebtedness policy as part of their foreign policy. I won't name any particular countries in that regard, but the College of William and Mary has done a marvelous job capturing the lack of transparency, the predatory terms and conditions, and that's why I was not a fan of the common framework that the G20 cooked up. It was a step in the right direction, I will acknowledge that, but it doesn't get the job done. I think the IMF and the World Bank should insist that when they are doing an analysis of a country, seeking a renewal or an extension of credit or a new balance of payment line, that by golly, they ought to have full transparency on the private sector and public sector borrowings, what the terms are, what the conditions are, and then we should, through technical assistance in these organizations, work outwardly along with our diplomats and our embassies around the world and other like-minded countries to what bad looks like. You're making a short-term expedient decision, but this is what bad looks like. And I think that over and over again, whether we're talking about Sri Lanka or Zambia or Ecuador, or there are plenty of examples that everybody in this room knows a lot more about than I do, but I think it's in alignment if we want greater transparency and we want market-based values to help lift people up out of poverty. And I think collectively since World War II, the developed countries working through the trading system and working through our multilateral have accomplished extraordinary things, including in China, where poverty has seen the largest change.
I want to talk to you a bit about Ukraine. Few people might not know, but you've been quite involved in Ukraine issues for some time. You've made several trips to the country while it's been at war. I recall just a few days after I had retired, it's funny to use that word, retired from the IMF, you called me the day Ukraine was invaded, and I already had lots of ideas about how to assist the country and what the U.S. should do. What do you kind of see as Ukraine's future in a post-conflict scenario? What are the roles of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF in that context?
Well, both have been immensely supportive, and we're grateful for the IMF's leadership there. We're particularly grateful for the World Bank serving as a clearinghouse and agent in accounting for all the multilateral financial assistance, including in partnership, with USAID over the past several months. So we appreciate that leadership. But in the planning for redevelopment, I think those two institutions working with the European Union, have an enormous role to play to make sure that Ukraine is fully integrated into Europe and can reject the nonsense that we've seen since February of 22. I mean, my advice is that we should be putting more heat on the Russian Federation. We did that in Congress early on, but in my view, this is my personal view, the G7 countries, President Biden, didn't keep that heat on because they wanted to operate on consensus in Europe. And I think that was a mistake. I think if the United States had stood up and put more pressure financially in the trading system and in the sanctions design, that we would have put more heat a lot earlier, a lot more effectively on the Russian economy and the Russian individual people in their country to let them know what a beastly, thing this was to invade Ukraine. And so both on the military support side and on the economic side, I believe that, the coalition could have done better. And I'm not saying that with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, I've said it consistently since February 3 years ago. So I would increase sanctions on Russia today, including all the banking system and all the energy system that's not currently sanctioned. I would work with Europe to achieve secondary sanctions on the people who are trading with Russia on the black market or openly. I would fully implement the Repo Act, which is supported by unanimous vote in the Council of Europe. The bill Mike McCall and I drafted, that we worked in conjunction with Senator Risch, and then we passed and President Biden signed into law the Repo Act. We had bipartisan consensus in the House and Senate, signed into law, and it got, in my judgment, watered down in the European consensus building. But not 100% of the countries in the Council of Europe voted to do it. What is that? It is, don't freeze the Russian assets, take the Russian assets. I appreciate everybody freezing them. That's very, we do that all the time. Let's change title. If the Russian Federation acts in a responsible way, they can have them back. But we have a compromise where we've now made a loan to Ukraine, and I would not have had those terms and conditions, but it's better than not doing anything. But if you want to send a message to Moscow, use repo. My message to President Trump is add sanctions to Russia, use repo fully, engage the family of nations to be tougher, not weaker, not looking down at their shoes for a photo op. That's what we need to be doing. And I think that will pursue a better, environment from which to, quote, negotiate.
I want to close on one topic that's been active in your committee recently, which is on digital finance, digital assets, and the STABLE Act. Acquaint this audience a bit of what the STABLE Act is when it passed your committee, and why you think it's so critical and why the president has prioritized this legislation on stablecoins.
Yeah. Look, for 60 years, we've had such an exceptional payment system in our world, and it's been amazing. We've gone from writing each other checks and bankers' acceptances and opening up correspondent banking accounts, and we signed patiently all those traveler's checks and put them in the money belt that our moms gave us, that somehow that was going to protect us in that very angry fight we were in Sao Paulo at a soccer game, you know. But we've morphed that to the global system of essentially Fedwire and SWIFT. We've seen the advent of credit. We've seen the advent of debit. It's been amazing. Now, real-time payments. So a future payment rail that will be added to what we have is a blockchain payment rail. And to use that effectively, you have to have a tokenized payment that is part of a smart contract or not, at retail or in business, commercial. And in our view, here in the United States, we believe it should be a dollar-backed stable coin. It's a dollar-backed payment stable coin issued under U.S. law by the private sector, both issued by bankers or non-banks, subject to the same capital standards, AML, BSA standards, regulatory standards, supervisory standards. And both the Senate and the House have now passed this inaugural bill in committee. Bill Hagerty, my old friend and great classmate from Vanderbilt, wrote the Senate version, and Brian Stile from Wisconsin wrote the House version. We've now passed that in both committees. It's an important extension of that payment system that's been essentially dollar-based for all these years since Bretton Woods 1.0. And it would be used both in business and in retail. Probably more so by international business, anything that crosses border. And it's in my judgment, we need a global standard on it. And right now, the payment stablecoin issuers either are under New York law or some extraterritorial jurisdiction. And we think this would be really good for the reserve currency status of the dollar, really good for innovation because it would allow people to invent new products and services in finance in the U.S. and be able to export that business, and we would have dominance in this new niche of financial services. Accompanying it, we had our first hearing 2 weeks ago on, is a market structure bill. Because if you just have a stablecoin bill, all you have is that. But it doesn't tell you who can own it, what do you do with it, who can custody it, how would it work? And so both in the House and Senate, we're working mightily together to create a market framework, a regulatory framework for all digital assets, the anchor of which would be the use of a dollar-backed stablecoin.
Well, that's all the time we have for today, but I want to thank you very much for coming.
Pleasure.
Please join me in
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
coming up during a recess.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it. Appreciate you.